What can psycholinguistics and deep learning teach each other? Recent deep learning systems have shown incredible competency in generating natural language, but the way they learn is quite different from how humans learn to use language. At the same time, there are some analogies between deep learning and human cognition that we shouldn't dismiss. So, what can we learn from the ways in which deep learning models have learned syntactic structure from their training data? How can we develop AI models that are more human like in order to study human cognition and linguistic capabilities? These are the types of questions that my guest today, Professor Tal Linzen, is interested in. His Computation and Psycholinguistics Lab uses behavioral experiments and computational methods to study how people learn and understand language. They also work on computational systems for language processing. In this conversation, we discussed his background and how he thinks about bringing psycholinguistic methodologies to deep learning, how progress in the field needs to be understood through the lens of what our goals are, how he thinks about inductive biases and linguistic generalization, and much more. This is the Gradient Podcast, and I am your host, Daniel Bashir. If you enjoy these episodes, you can follow us wherever you're listening to this podcast episode. You can also follow us on Substack to get regular notifications whenever we release a new article, newsletter, or podcast episode. You can also find our online magazine at thegradient.pub, where we regularly publish essays by the sorts of people I interview on the podcast. And finally, if you enjoy the episode, it would mean a great deal to us all if you'd consider leaving us a review on whatever podcast player you're using to listen to this episode. It helps more listeners like you find what we're doing and helps us bring in more interesting guests for you to listen to. But now, without further ado, Tal Linzen. Professor Linzen, as your website kind of states, I'm literally just stealing the words from there. You studied the mental representations that constitute our knowledge of language, how we use them to understand and produce language, and how we can create computational systems that learn language as efficiently and robustly as humans, which to me is a really fascinating research program. So I'd love to know how you got interested in the space of AI in the first place and how this became your research goal.
Yeah, I actually ended up in AI in a bit of a roundabout way because before I even started in academia, I worked in tech as a sort of a machine learning researcher slash software engineer. And when I was choosing a program to do my PhD in, I was actually trying to get away to some extent from computer science. I was looking to do something different, and I ended up focusing on more human experimental psycholinguistics for my PhD. At least at first, I was doing a lot of cognitive neuroscience actually with this exotic machine called MEG. And that's what I was doing for the first few years of my PhD. But then gradually, as time went on, I realized that the computational approaches to understanding the mind are the ones that I find maybe more promising than the kind of purely experimental ones. And the thesis ended up being a combination of computational and experimental work. None of it was at that point AI per se. It was more like using machine learning to understand what humans do in experiments. But then when I graduated from my PhD and I was looking for jobs, and then I found this postdoc that in Paris that was looking for people with a linguistics background that were interested in using that background to understand AI systems. So at that time, that was I guess 2015, and it was the beginning of all the breakthroughs that we were seeing with deep learning, and people were very impressed by what these systems were able to learn. with basically no supervision. At the time, it was just Word to Vec. It wasn't ChatGPT or anything. It was like very simple systems, but they were still doing surprising things, and they were looking for people with a linguistics background to analyze those systems. And that's kind of how I got more into the other side of the AI, which is not just using machine learning to understand humans, but also working on the applied systems themselves, but maybe using tools from linguistics, cognitive science to understand them better. And that's where it started.
We'll be getting into many more details, I think, on how this looks soon, but maybe sticking at the high perspective, I'd love to hear you comment a little bit more on this intersection and how you think about it. And maybe as a prompt here, no pun intended, I really like this phrasing from one of your perspectives articles. I think you wrote this in 2019, where you sort of discussed how in machine learning research, we typically emphasize test cases that are pretty similar to training examples. And you're looking at, well, what can linguists bring to this picture? And so you said the construction of test materials that avoid confounds, if we want to like isolate linguistic capacities, requires close attention to experimental design. Paradigms and methodologies from psycholinguistics can be helpful here. So it's really like with that background in psycholinguistics and kind of understanding what do linguistic competencies look like? How do we really test them? You're bringing this experimental methodology and then sort of applying it to deep learning. And there's a bit of a back and forth there. But I'd love to hear you comment a little bit more on how you think about that.
Yeah, so the issue that we have with evaluation, I think evaluation has gotten a lot more sophisticated in the last decade. When I was just getting into the field, the way you would evaluate a language model, that let's say a system that is designed to predict the next word, is by having it predict the next word in a new text that it wasn't trained on and seeing how successful it was, how high was the probability that it assigns to the words that occurred in that text. But the issue with that form of evaluation is that it's pretty easy to predict the next word without knowing a lot about the structure of the sentence, because in most sentences, uh, you can do pretty well just by looking at the most recent 3 or 4 words, and that will give you, like, if you're able to memorize sequences of words, you can do pretty well at predicting the next word. So to really determine if you have a certain linguistic ability or reasoning ability for the language model, you need to construct specific sentences or find specific sentences in your corpus where it's really important to understand the structure of the sentence to be able to predict the next word. You want to ignore all of the cases where you can predict the next word with these like cheaper tricks, let's say, and focus on cases that the only way that the model is able to predict the next word correctly is if it figured out the structure of the argument or the sentence. So that's the kind of thing that we do in psychology as well when we work with humans. We try to isolate, we try to create materials that are matched for everything else except the one thing that we are trying to compare between two different groups, or the one thing that we're trying to evaluate this person's ability in.
So, in one direction we've got here, this is the question of what can linguistic, psycholinguistic paradigms bring to the study of deep learning and getting a better sense of what are the powers and limitations of contemporary models. But you're also interested in this opposite direction of how can the successes and the failures of deep learning models help us understand how humans represent how we use language. And in this domain, I want to ask you actually a little bit of a kind of high level methodological question. And it's sort of about this. I think that when the models that we used for language were simple enough, things like n-gram language models, you might find some interesting things there, but I don't think anybody would have thought that they really were representative of the full scope of maybe what's going on in a human brain. But now that we are seeing these deep learning models, I think that there is this general sense of people starting to question or at least wonder, well, to what extent are human linguistic capabilities really represented by the models that we have today? And the question this brings up for me is I think Winograd articulated this really well, but a lot of people have sort of critiqued this scientific mistake that I think they articulate as I am trying to figure out the causal mechanisms behind some behavior, in this case, the use of language. I come up with a model, maybe a computational model, and this model produces that behavior. So, like our language models today. And that language model might involve representations of its own or mechanisms by which it produces this behavior. And because, as far as I can empirically test, this model achieves a desired behavior. So, speaking human sounding language, I then assume that the subject whose behavior I was originally studying, so the human in this case, has the same internal model as the model that I just created to produce that behavior. In this case, I'm assuming that the human is just like the machine. There's a bit of like an epistemic barrier here, but it's, I guess, something that feels like a sort of potential mistake that requires really careful thinking. And so I suppose in using computational models and studying what mental representations constitute our knowledge of language, how do you think about the role of this sort of at least potential error in your work and about avoiding it?
So the error is concluding from the fact that the behavior of the model is similar to the behavior of people. So the error is concluding from that they work in the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I would first of all, I would be skeptical of the argument that two systems work behave in exactly the same way. But I think so. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that if two systems behave in exactly the same way, then that's a really good starting point for assuming that the model works in the same way as the human. In fact, there's very little that we know about humans' internal representations that is not derived from human behavior. So it's not like we have any direct access to humans' internal representations. What we know from neuroscience is very basic. Our techniques don't really allow us to reconstruct the representations in the same detail that studying human behavior and what kind of mistakes you make, for example, can teach us. So I would say that the behavioral analysis is basically most of what we have to go on. So it's very likely, I guess, that if the system makes exactly the same errors that a human makes, that that is something similar about the representations that the system and the human use. At least that's most of what we have to go on. The one caveat to that is that we should probably also try to match the development of the system and the human. So this is an argument that is maybe sometimes lost. I think that it's much more likely that the representations will be the same if the systems are exposed to the same training data, for example, as a human might be exposed to. That's a big difference that we have, at least these days, between the commercially available language models and humans, where we train our language models in a dramatically different way from humans. So it's likely that because of that, the representations that they evolve are different from the ones that humans evolve. My hunch, though, is that if the representations are really different, there's going to be a behavioral effect of that difference. So they're going to make different errors than the humans. And in fact, that is actually what we're seeing in the behavioral evidence. So I think you're asking a very good question about whether there could be two systems with exactly the same behavior but different representations. The answer is probably yes, but it's almost unknowable given how little we know about humans' internal representation that's not derived from their behavior.
I think the way that you answered that question also points to a couple of key distinctions that might be made here. One of them is, of course, when, as you said, you're controlling for the training data that is used and the amount of what's going on. And I think we're going to get into one of your works on accelerating progress towards human like linguistic generalization, in which you make the argument that when we are, in fact, assessing deep learning models, we should be controlling for the amount of training data, the size of the model, these sorts of things. The other aspect of it, too, though, I think, is that empirical question of what does it mean to have exactly the same behavior? And I think that maybe our sense of what it is to have that behavior has become more refined over time, especially as systems have become more and more capable. Maybe 10 years ago, a chatbot, I mean, people were pretty convinced by chatbots then, or at least some people were. And by today's standards, they are not very good. Today's are certainly a lot better. And now we can bring stuff that you're doing, linguistic paradigms and those sorts of measures to bear. And I suppose another kind of interesting thing too is then to what level of analysis of capabilities can we really think about this? I think, the Turing test is something that always comes to mind, but that in its original form, people will kind of pare it down to, well, I'm going to have a chatbot interface with somebody for 10 minutes, and that's the Turing test. And that's really, at least if you're to believe somebody like Stefan Harnad, not exactly what Turing meant. And as you kind of dig down further, right, when you assess the systems, well, if you now have a robot, its robotic capabilities, or maybe the microstructure of what's going on in there, then I think to what you're saying, you get fewer and fewer degrees of freedom, as it were, of what the potential implementations of this behavior could look like.
Right. Yeah, I guess there's one thing that is maybe not clear from what I said before, which is that it's not that our models are so good that they're becoming closer and closer to humans, and therefore we can conclude that there are differences in their representations. In fact, what is happening is in a lot of cases we're going in an opposite direction where the models are becoming less and less like humans, which I think leads to the conclusion that their internal representations are different from humans. So let me give you just a couple of examples. The language models that we have right now, and maybe it's not surprising, they have uh, much more a much greater working memory capacity than humans. And what I mean by that is that you can give a language model a list of 200 words and ask it to repeat that list, and it will repeat it verbatim without any problems. This is not something that any human can do. And the models are able to memorize very long sequences of words from their training data. This is all from work that I've been involved in. So you can see that the model is able to repeat very long speeches, let's say, that have occurred in its training data a few times. So those are superhuman abilities in some sense. They're maybe not that impressive because it's easy to write a computer program that gives you back a list of 200 words that you give to it. But it just shows very clearly that the representations that the models are using are different from the representations that humans are using. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good for for computers to be better than humans. And so you don't want a calculator to make the same mistakes as the human does, but when multiplying two really big numbers. But it does show that the calculator has very different representations from humans.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that distinction. I think that's an important one to sort of bring up in the context of this conversation. And I guess relevantly, I do recall as well in the domain of, if you are interested in making something a little bit more human like, then maybe that's a separate enterprise from doing the types of things we might want to do with today's deep learning systems. But if your goal is let's make this a little bit more human like, then yes, maybe you do want to put restrictions on some of these things like working memory. I know June Park's work on generative agents, for example, they were trying to make these things more reasonably human. And so their implementation of what memory looked like for these agents, they, of course, I think relevantly made the same observation you did that we humans do not have that in the limit getting to infinite working memory, but that there has to be some sort of limitation there. And maybe the way that we collect and retrieve memories looks rather different from just that sort of memorization that you clarified here. I'd love to dive into a couple of your specific research papers so maybe we can flesh out some of how this tends to look in practice. And the first one I was thinking of was this paper on assessing the ability of LSTMs to learn syntax sensitive dependencies. And so there was sort of this question of linguistic regularities. These are sensitive to syntactic structure, and you wanted to see if these dependencies can be captured by LSTMs. Could you maybe give a bit of an introduction to some of what you were going after here, maybe a bit of the methodology, how you probe a model for its modeling of syntactic structure and the conclusions?
Sure, yeah. So this is I think, well-known fact in linguistics that you can't always model sentences as just sequences of words. So in most cases, the correct way to represent a sentence is as a structured entity that has, let's say, groupings of words that are each called constituents that are organized in a hierarchical way. So you have a big constituent that is constituted by two smaller constituents. And it's not just a sequence of words. So let me give you an example, and I'm just going to use the specific example that we use in the paper, which is subject-verb agreement, right? So in English, if you have a present tense verb in the third person, it has to agree in number with the subject. What it means is that if the subject is singular, the verb also needs to be singular. So we have the dog runs, and if the subject is plural, the verb also needs to be plural, like the dogs run. So you might think, well, it's easy to learn that because the dog is right next to the word run. So you can just memorize sequences of words. Dog goes with runs and dogs goes with run. But it doesn't always work that way because in some cases, you'll have a noun that's right next to the verb that's actually not the relevant noun. So it would be something like the dogs in the park run, right? So park is a singular word, but that's not the subject. It's irrelevant. You're supposed to ignore it and know that the subject is actually the word dogs that occurred a lot earlier. So to figure out which, and sometimes you have many nouns in the sentence, and to figure out which of those nouns is the one that determines whether the verb should be singular or plural, you need to understand the structure of the sentence. And the structure of the sentence is not something that is written in the sentence. It's latent, basically. It's something that you need to infer from the sequence of words. So that is the premise, I guess, of the field of syntax in linguistics, that there's a lot of structure behind each sentence. It's not literally represented in the sequence of words.
In the discussion section for this paper, you said that a network that has acquired syntactic representation sophisticated enough to handle what you're talking about, this subject verb agreement, would also show improved performance on other structure sensitive dependencies. So you specifically said pronoun co-reference, quantifier scope, negative polarity items. I suppose one thing I'm curious about in this regard is I can imagine maybe some of these structure sensitive dependencies might be a bit more similar to one another in terms of the grammatical patterns, maybe the types of syntactic representations they demand in order to deal with them correctly. I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that a little bit, but then also what it is, if this is really a thing, to have syntactic representations sophisticated enough to handle certain dependencies, but maybe not others? Like, are there, levels of difficulty to this that you think about?
Yeah, definitely. So the reason we started with subject-verb agreement is that it's so simple. I mean, I was able to describe it in 30 seconds, and many sentences have that dependency. So, in retrospect, 10 years later, it looks like we were kind of lowballing. It's kind of an easy thing for the model to do, but we were actually quite surprised that the models were able to do that at all at the time. So it just goes, I think, to show how different our expectations have become from deep learning models. At the time, LSTM language models were just coming on the scene, and no one knew what they were able to do. So that's why we started with such a simple phenomenon that is so pervasive. Then there are a lot of phenomena that are a lot less frequent in the training data. And then it becomes a question of how many examples of this phenomenon do you need to learn it. And are you able to learn it from the same number of examples that a human is able to learn these things? And there's definitely easier phenomena and harder phenomena, not just because of their frequency, but that's one big issue. And I guess since when we worked on that paper, many other phenomena from people in my group, but also in a bunch of other groups tested language models on many different phenomena in many different languages. And the picture is mixed. I guess in some cases, the results were less impressive than in the cases that we looked at in the first study.
Let's move to your work on RNNs implicitly implement tensor product representations. And so I guess this one was kind of interesting to me because you're looking at continuous vector representations of symbolic structures. And I suppose what feels so interesting about that is there's also this sort of long standing what are the capabilities and limitations of connectionist architectures versus symbolist architectures? And you had these famous criticisms, Fodor and Polition, sort of on connectionism broadly. And so you mentioned this hypothesis that neural network representations might implicitly encode compositional structure, which feels really interesting in that background. I'd love to hear you kind of introduce a little bit about this work and maybe how you came to that conclusion.
Right. This actually ties in with something that came up earlier in our conversation, where if a system behaves in a certain way, then you sometimes need to conclude from that behavior that it has a certain kind of representations. So what happens in a neural network? The representations are always vectors. They're always distributed representation. They're called. So instead of the way that you would think about a list, let's say you had a list of numbers and you were asked to reverse that list, and the list was 1, 6, 4. So the way that you would reverse it is you would say, okay, so the thing that was in the last position in that list was 4. Let me produce that first. And then the thing was second to last position was 6. Let me produce that, and so on. And that is a symbolic algorithm because it uses categories like first position, second position, and 4 and 6, right? Those are symbols. Now, and in a neural network, the representations are all vectors. So you have just one vector that represents the sequence 1, 6, 4, and then maybe another vector that represents the sequence whatever it is, the reverse of it, 4, 6, 1. And you're supposed to, if you're a neural network that is designed to reverse lists, what you're supposed to do is to take that vector and as an input and produce the other vector as an output. So what we argue is that it's, to the extent that the neural network is able to reverse the sequence, it must at least implicitly have representations that reflect the symbolic structure of the list. So it's not that it's literally running Python code that has symbols in it, but there's an isomorphism of sorts between the vectors that the system is using to represent the lists and the symbolic structure that we hypothesize is required to perform this task. So in that paper, we mostly Tom McCoy, who was a lead author in that paper, we propose a method for mapping a hypothesis about the symbolic structure that we think is represented in the vectors onto a set of vectors that we get from a neural network. And then we find this very remarkable correspondence between our hypothesis and the system's internal representation. So what this shows is that if you really, if the network has a lot of evidence that it needs to perform a symbolic task, like taking a string of symbols and reversing it, then it is capable of developing internal representations that are basically isomorphic to the symbolic representations that we think are necessary to do this task. Maybe to clarify, by isomorphic, I just mean that there is some mapping between the structure of the vector representations and the symbolic theory that we have in mind.
Right, right. There's a representational sort of equivalence that can happen there. And I guess there's some important takeaways here too for us in basically what you were just saying about if I have evidence that I need to perform a particularly symbolic task, well, that maybe has some implications for if we are interested in a lot of work recently has studied limitations of transformers on compositionality. I remember the recent Faith and Fate paper that did some really good work on this front, I felt then that maybe has some implications for the particular training tasks that we might look at. So you gave that example of reversing a sequence as one. And I suppose, too, there are also, of course, sort of the architectural interventions. I think it might have been a few years earlier than this, but I remember Richard Socher and co, sort of in Chris Manning's lab, were experimenting with these hierarchically structured RNNs that had tree structures and looking at more closely representing what grammatical structure tended to look like. And so I'm sort of curious about when you were writing this paper at the time and maybe looking at some of these takeaways, what sort of lines of exploration along those directions, if any, that kind of prompted.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. So the very simple tasks that we looked at that paper, the like reversing a list, those are tasks where it's clear that the only way to solve them is by having some sort of symbolic representation of which number was in which place in that list. There's no other way to do it. You give them on a lot of evidence that it has to do it in a lot of inputs and output pairs that it can only map if it figured out that there's some sort of symbolic structure there. When it comes to natural language, it gets messier because often, as I kind of mentioned before, you can get away with cheaper tricks in many cases. So in often you can fake it. You can give the impression that you understand something about the sentence without really knowing which word occurred first and which word occurred afterwards. And we have a lot of work that shows that the models do, in fact, if you just train them on natural language, they will learn those tricks instead of the structured representation that will generalize in all of the cases. That you'll do well on 95% of the cases, but then there'll be the 5% where things will go wrong. So what this shows is that for some of the simpler architectures, they need a lot of evidence that the domain is structured to learn those structured representations. And if you don't give them a ton of evidence, they will get lazy. They will just do something dumb, something simpler. Now, if you have an architecture like the tree structured neural network or other architectures that are less lazy in that sense, then you can learn from maybe a smaller amount of evidence that the representations need to be structured. All right, that's called a inductive bias, right? You
Yes.
have the learner has some sort of tendency to develop the right representations that lead it to generalize in the way that he wanted to. So that's where I think the motivation for the more complex architectures comes in. They require less evidence to learn and generalize in the appropriate structural way.
I think this is a great segue into your next paper on accelerating progress towards human-like linguistic generalization, precisely with that note of inductive bias, because now the models that we are working with, transformers primarily, do not have very strong inductive biases at all. And so while they can become extremely powerful by pre-training, as you noted earlier, there is this mismatch between the amount of training data that a language model might need to achieve something that seems like linguistic competence versus what a human is, where a human is going to get with less data. And so, maybe to introduce this one, I'd love for you to describe sort of what you're responding to here. This, what you describe as a pre training, agnostic, identically distributed evaluation paradigm that you're critiquing.
Yeah. So there's two parts there. The what I call pre-trained agnostic is that you take two different models that are trained on vastly different data sets, but you evaluate them on you compare them head to head, basically on the same data set, and that is problematic. It's the reason it's problematic is that you're not giving a more data efficient model a chance to succeed there, because the model that is trained on more data is able to succeed maybe using certain tricks, certain memorization techniques that the model that's trained on less data is not able to resort to. And just to give a sense of the discrepancy between the amounts of data that the models are trained on, it's actually gotten a lot worse since I wrote that paper a few years ago. So our estimates of how many words a human hears before they get to, I don't know, college in the United States would be something like 50 million to 100 million, let's say. And then the language models that we train these days, the big language models like PaLM, ChatGPT, and so on, are trained on trillions of words. So those are many orders of magnitudes more words. So if you compare a human or a model that's trained on a small amount of data to the models that train on a lot of data, the models that train on a lot of data can solve the tasks by just copying examples from the training set, or finding examples in their training set that are very similar to the example that they're asked to do something with. Whereas humans and the models that are trained on less data are forced to use some sort of more sophisticated generalization technique, just because it's different enough from anything that they've seen before. So it might be, let's say, we've worked a lot on compositionality, where you have, what it means is that you have a complex sentence that's made up of two simpler sentences, but they're combined in a way that is unfamiliar to you. So if you're a human or you're a model that's trained on 50 million words, the only way that you could understand that more complex sentence is by taking the simpler sentences that might be similar to what you've seen before, and then combining them using an algorithm of combining meanings. But the model that's trained on 2 trillion words, it's very likely that it's seen that structure before. It's not going to be new to the model. It's not going to have to generalize. It's going to just use some sort of memorization related trick. So that's why it doesn't really make sense to evaluate the two kinds of models in the same way. The other thing that I talked about in that paper, the identically distributed evaluation, we talked about that a little bit at the beginning, where I guess the issue was that if you teach the model to do some sort of task by giving it a lot of examples of that task, let's say you give it two sentences and you ask the model, does the second sentence follow from the first one? Meaning that every time the first one is true, the second one also has to be true. That's a very common evaluation task. So you give the model, let's say, 100,000 examples of the task, and then you ask it to perform that task for another set of 1,000 examples, let's say. So it turns out that usually when that happens, the model can learn to perform this task in a way that doesn't reflect what you would want it to do. It will learn various properties of that data set, and because there is the same distribution in the training and test set, any pattern that it finds in the training set is going to also apply to the test set. So that's the argument, I guess, that I made. I think it's not maybe that controversial, that the idea of fine-tuning a model on 100,000 examples of the task and then testing it on more examples from exactly the same distribution might lead to misleading results, where there might be some sort of signal that's correlated with the labels in the training set that the model can then apply to the test set. So that is actually something that has changed quite a bit in the last few years. So people don't evaluate models by fine-tuning them on hundreds of thousands of examples anymore, which I think is great. One of the surprising citations, I think, I remember reading the GPT-3 paper and seeing, oh, they cited this paper as my kind of position piece as, look, now we're doing few-shot learning. Like we're just showing the model a couple of examples, and it's generalizing from those two examples. We don't need to do fine tuning anymore. So that addresses the issue that I brought up in my position piece, which it does. I think it's great. If I mean, I think it's questionable whether the models do in fact do zero shot learning, or few shot learning. But if they do, then I think that addresses the concerns that I had in that paper. But the other concern, the training data size issue, is only getting worse, I think.
Yeah, it does seem that way. The few shot or the in context learning capabilities do seem like an interesting kind of case study here. And I know there's been some really interesting work recently on how larger models do in context learning differently. And I guess one thing that may or may not be related to this, but that I've been thinking a lot about recently is how that kind of interacts with some of the work studying how in context learning might implicitly implement like a single step of gradient descent or something, and whether as you get towards larger models and the way they do in context learning, whether that's maybe reflective of sort of more complicated algorithms implicitly going on under the hood. But that's sort of like a line of intersections I've been curious about. On the question of training data size, though, since you mentioned this is getting worse, I'm curious what you think about as potential ways to begin remediating this sort of issue. It does seem hard that, well, even though Llama and Palm might be at pretty different scales, maybe I can start restricting like classes of models where, I compared the 70 million billion parameter models to the other 70 billion parameter models and control that in some sense. But I probably would like to have some way to compare the 70 billion parameter model trained on 2 trillion tokens to the 500 billion parameter model that is trained on maybe fewer tokens and think about how that stacks up. But that does seem fundamentally hard. And I think for a lot of reasons you've highlighted. How do you think about potential mitigation strategies, what that could look like?
Yeah, well, so I think that is it's an interesting question if it's getting worse. So when I said that it's getting worse, is that the difference in training data between, I guess, people and models is increasing. I'm not sure that it's so bad for the applications that Palm or whatever is designed to be used for, that is trained on that many words. That I think that the jury's still out. I mean, one thing that is clearly the case is that we don't have the same amount of data that we have for English for all other languages. So we can find 10 trillion words in English on the internet, but we're not going to be able to find that for Maltese, or I don't know, like a smaller language that has fewer speakers. So I think it's an open question how far we can get by training models on a huge amount of data from English and then using some cross-lingual transfer techniques to import that knowledge into a Maltese language model, let's say. So it's it's possible. I'm sorry, there was some error. So it's possible that if we had models that are able to learn from less data, we would do better in low resource languages. But another way to do better on low resource languages is to improve cross-lingual transfer. So that's one thing. The other part of, so I guess what I'm trying to say here is that there are two goals here for having models that can learn from less data. One is the more applied goal, which I think being able to learn in a domain where you have less data, or in a language that you have less data, that's a clear applied goal there. The other goal is the cognitive modeling goal. So that's even if this doesn't directly advance AI, I think that it's very likely that we'll have better models of human language processing and of the human brain if those models operate under the same constraints that humans do. So, I mean, there's a lot of work now that takes GPT-4 or something, or GPT-3, and looks at its internal vectors and then maps those vectors into brain activity. So I think that it's a really interesting direction, but I think that we're going to get better and better at modeling brain activity if we have models that are more similar, that learn in the same way that humans do and with the same constraints.
That seems right. I'd love to move on to another paper that you worked on, and this was titled Surprisal Does Not Explain Syntactic Disambiguation Difficulty, to give a spoiler for the conclusion you came to. And your question here was sort of to what degree can processing difficulty in syntactically complex sentences be explained by predictability as estimated using computational language models? Could you maybe sort of break down a little bit that question, how you think about it, some of the questions like what is and how do you measure something like processing difficulty, and what it means for that to be explained by predictability?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked about that project. It's one of my favorite projects. So we can only measure human processing difficulty indirectly. So we mean by processing difficulty is something like this person takes longer to read this word, or maybe if we track their eye movements, they will get stuck on that word and maybe reread it, or maybe go back a little and reread it again. So that's how processing difficulty is reflected in behavioral measurements from human experiments. In that study, we actually used a very simple technique called self-paced reading, where we just have the person read the sentence word by word, and to move to the next word, the person has to press the spacebar or some keys, and they only see one word at a time. And you can see that when a word is surprising, people will linger on it more than when a word is less surprising. So that's something that we know across the board. Predictable words are read faster than unpredictable words. That's not controversial. So what you can do with that is, if you have a good computational model of word prediction, like the language models that we have, you can take the predictability estimates from the language model and try to use those to predict human reading times. And that will give you a sense of how similar the word predictions are that the models are making to the word predictions that humans are making. And then you can determine how much of the processing difficulty that humans experience in different kinds of sentences has to do with the predictability of the words versus other factors. So let me give you an example of one of those types of sentences that classically in psycholinguistics people have shown that people experience a lot of processing difficulty in. So those are called garden path sentences. So sometimes when you say them out loud, they don't sound as confusing as when you read them. So it would be something like, the student read the newspaper was going out of business, let's say. So usually people will start reading that sentence and they'll be like, okay, the student read the newspaper, great. But then it turns out that actually that's not what happened. The student read a story about the newspaper going out of business, right? So you have one interpretation at the beginning of the sentence and you then have to revise. That's kind of the intuition behind those class of sentences. So what we did in that study was look at those particularly difficult sentences and see to what extent the predictability estimates from the language model can explain the processing difficulty that people experience in those sentences. And the conclusions were that they really do not explain that processing difficulty. So to us, what that means is that you can interpret the results in actually a couple of different ways. But one interpretation that the language models are just not very surprised by those words because they, again, like the issues that we discussed before with working memory, language models are just better at people at considering multiple different interpretations of the sentence at the same time. So they're not as surprised as we are.
Sure.
And there's actually evidence that the better the language model is at predicting the next word, the worse it becomes at how well it matches human reading. So that supports that conclusion that, again, the language models are just so much better at reading than we are as humans with our limited capacity. So they don't have to make the same compromises, I guess, that humans do, and they can just read faster, so to speak, though that analogy is very loose.
This is the compromises aspect is really interesting, and you do kind of importantly note that the results don't imply or they don't license the conclusion that prediction plays no role whatsoever in language comprehension. So maybe there is some kind of role there, but I am really curious in the realm of human sentence processing difficulty, how you think about what other factors besides predictability might importantly be at play. And you sort of brought up this case of garden path sentences, and now I'm sort of thinking about my own experiences reading. And I think that it was maybe when I was first reading, like Proust, for example, where I sort of encountered some of the most complex sentences I'd ever had to read. And he sort of throws all of these different things at you where you have these incredibly long descriptive phrases, and then he'll use like a pronoun that's referring to something that's like 100 words earlier. And so you have to kind of parse that out. And so I found myself, it wasn't just prediction, but I was sort of using these strategies as I was reading him of, okay, I take like 100 words out of a sentence and just sort of like bracket it out in my mind and sort of, think about, okay, the sentence starts here. There's all this stuff that is describing something, an important phrase describing, a person or some artifact or something, and then all this stuff that is going on over here. And so there's this sort of like spatial aspect of it. And so you were kind of mentioning earlier in testing, human sort of reading or looking at one word at a time. And I guess that struck me because especially in reading, maybe if somebody's reading like really complicated literature or something, that is probably not going to be what exactly they're doing. They might have to think about, well, what is almost the spatial layout of the sentence? How do different parts kind of puzzle together? And so I'm curious how you think about that and sort of what is going on when we are having difficulty processing sentences.
Yeah, I've had that experience a lot recently because I've been spending a lot of time reading in German. It's one of my summer projects, and most German novels have extremely complex sentences like the ones that you just mentioned, with a lot of, I guess, what's called center embedding, where you have a sentence that kind of breaks up another sentence in the middle, and then you go back to the earlier sentence, and you need to keep that in your memory. So it's interesting, actually, that as far as I know, that if I remember correctly, I'm not an expert on this, that German speakers are better at parsing center embedded sentences than English speakers are, just because they have so much more practice at it because of those insanely convoluted sentence structures. So I think that's a really interesting question that I don't know the answer to, whether people who are reading novels that have very complex sentences, or people who are used to reading in more complex genres or languages, have different reading strategies than just the average person. And I think that sounds very plausible to me. I mean, I definitely catch myself, that there's this thing in German that famously, that some verbs, you kind of split them in half, and you put one half at the end of the sentence and the other half at the beginning of the sentence. And I do catch myself often when reading in German. When I see the first half, I know that something is going to happen all the way at the end of the sentence. So I go to the end of the sentence and then read that and come back. Whether German speakers who have more practice than me do that as well, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, I'm just speculating here. That's not something that I've done any academic work on.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I guess it's interesting. I guess another place this kind of comes up too is sort of the kind of analytic attempt to, reduce language to propositions that you could represent in a mathematical form. When you think about like nothing is X, then that sort of becomes this proposition of there does not exist some X such that P of X or something. And then so when you encounter certain sort of sentences like, Heidegger's kind of the nothing nothings, then I think a lot of people who are sort of really knee deep in that analytic tradition just look at that sentence and they're like, it's totally meaningless because that was maybe their way of parsing sentences and putting together like what it is to mean something. But yeah, I guess that question of different strategies is really interesting to me. There was one last paper I wanted to discuss with you, and this was more recent, how to plant trees and language models. And this was really, I think, maybe settling on some of the themes we've already begun to discuss about data and architectural effects on the emergence of syntactic inductive biases. And so you sort of cite some recent work finding that pre-training can teach language models to rely on these hierarchical syntactic features. Again, something we've kind of discussed, and you focused on specifically architectural features in this work. I guess I'd love for you to describe some of the procedures you sort of followed in this work and maybe some of the conclusions there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking about this. I really like this project. It's a very, very recent one as well. The starting point, I guess, is the discourse around scaling laws in the language modeling deep learning world. And what people usually do in that work is they will plot on the x-axis, let's say, the number of flops that the model was trained on, basically how much computation happened during the training of the model. Or there would be something like the number of parameters in the model, some very coarse grained measure of how big the model is, basically. And then on the y-axis, you would have the performance of the model on some task. So what we asked in that paper is whether it's really just about how much data you throw at the model or how big the model is, or whether there are some properties of the architecture that affect how likely the model is to learn to generalize in the correct way, in the way that is consistent with the linguistic structure of the sentence and not with some sort of sequences of words that are not quite, that are correlated maybe, but are not quite, don't quite capture the structure of the sentence. As we discussed at the beginning, like with subject-verb agreement, are you going to learn something about, are you going to learn to really identify the subject, or are you going to use some sort of strategy that is based on sequences of words that will work sometimes, but will fail in other cases. So what we did in that study was to we didn't actually explore different architectures exactly. We stuck to the same architecture, that transformer, which is the architecture that all of the language models use these days. But we looked at different shapes of the transformer. Basically, you can have the same number of parameters, but you can allocate them differently to the depth of the model versus the width. So you can have the word embeddings be 200 dimensional versus 1,000 dimensional. So you multiply by 5 the number of parameters in the model, or you can multiply the number of layers by 5, and then the total number of parameters will be the same, but the way they're allocated across the layers is going to be different. And well, we found some preliminary evidence, I would say. We're currently following up on it in a more controlled study that suggests that deeper models are more likely to learn the correct syntactic behavior than shallower models. If you keep the number of parameters constant, it's better to have a deeper model than a wide model. So that's the kind of experiment that I think is a little bit of an antidote to just looking at this, taking a very bird's eye view of just how big the model is. No, it does matter how you structure the model. And my sense is that if you take a model that is quite different from a transformer, as like the models that you mentioned before, you might get much stronger syntactic generalization behavior from training on a much smaller amount of data or flops, computation steps.
You said the work in this paper suggests that transformers, when trained in cognitively relevant regimes, might be fruitful models for human language acquisition and processing. How do you think about what a cognitively relevant regime is?
Yeah, so the other part of the paper was I so far I've only talked about the architecture, where how you allocate the parameters to width versus depth. The other part was we looked at how fast the model learns to generalize in the correct way when it's trained on different types of language. So usually you train models on data from the internet, or in some experiments you train them on something like Wikipedia, like a clean website. And we were curious what would happen if you trained them instead on something like the words, the language that a child hears growing up. So we used the child directed speech corpus, Childus, which is just like a collection of a lot of transcribed recordings from interactions between caregivers and children. And We trained exactly the same transformer model on the different types of data, and what we found is that, surprisingly to me at least, it looks like when you train the model on child-directed speech, it actually learns syntax faster than when you train it on Wikipedia or on data from the internet. And it looks like the amount of the child-directed speech that we have, that's only, we only have something like 10 million words in that corpus, which is even less than a child would hear growing up. But even that seems to be enough to teach the transformer enough about syntax, or go a long way towards teaching it about syntax. So that's what we meant by cognitively plausible. It looks like there might be something about the simpler languages, the simpler language that's used when you communicate with a child, that kind of clues you into the structure of language better than starting from more complex sentences like Wikipedia or Proust.
I did want to ask a little bit about this procedure that you're thinking about in terms of why does simpler language teach syntax more effectively. And I was kind of reminded of your earlier 2016 paper where you were assessing that ability of LSTMs to learn syntax sensitive dependencies, where you said something that felt a little bit different at first, but I think I can now reason through it, where you said that neural networks can be encouraged to develop more sophisticated generalizations by oversampling grammatically challenging training sentences. And so you're sort of looking at two different techniques here. Do you think of the acquisition of syntax then as a sort of different goal here than what we are trying to do, where we're sampling simpler sentences in order to let the model acquire syntax more effectively?
Yeah, that's a really nice observation, actually. I think you're pointing out a tension there that we should resolve. I'm not sure. So what you're saying and what we said in that paper is that actually when you give the model a lot of complex sentences in training, it ends up learning more about syntax. So I think that, I mean, just like thinking on my feet right now, I hadn't thought about this before. I think what happened in that early experiment is that when we gave the model a lot of examples, that the trick where you just look at the most recent word and decide based on that if the verb should be singular or plural, you gave it a lot of counterexamples to that trick. And eventually it figures it out. Or at least it does better than if you don't give it a lot of counterexamples. So obviously that's not so interesting, because what we really care about is models that learn from the normal distribution of sentences. You don't want to have to give the model counterexamples to the wrong rules that it might learn. You just want it to learn the right rules from the natural distribution. So I think my hypothesis for why child-directed speech might be more effective in kind of bootstrapping syntactic structure is because it has a lot of short, simple sentences and even fragments of sentences. So sometimes it will just be a noun phrase like the red balloon. That will be the entire thing that the child hears. So that tells you, okay, the red balloon is its own thing. It's a unit. Let me think of it as a constituent if I ever see it again in other sentences. So that those simple units kind of bootstrap your grammar induction. And if all of the sentences that you see are these incredibly long, the average sentence in Wikipedia I think is like 20 word long, then you don't know where to start. You need a lot more examples to try to start to find commonalities between sentences and figure out that the sequence of words is the subject in both of these sentences and so on. Now I'm really speculating here. I would like, I mean, we have a couple of projects that are trying to explore the different hypotheses in this space, but I don't have anything empirical to say about it yet.
Sure. One intuitive thing that sticks out to me and kind of overlapping those two observations as well is in the realm of making something sort of biologically plausible, or the way humans actually learn things. You brought up importantly that sort of bootstrapping grammar induction with these more simplistic sentences makes sense. And so you could imagine a training procedure that then sort of gradually becomes more complex. So at the beginning, a child is, of course, going to learn with those very simple sentences you pointed out. And only later on do you hit something with more grammatically complex sentences. And I don't know what that looks like in terms of what it might imply for like the learning of representations and how that sort of evolves. But that seems like the sort of procedure that would seem like intuitively, this is the way humans tend to get better at dealing with language.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that the student who worked on this project, Aaron Mueller, who recently graduated and is now starting a postdoc. So he's really interested in that direction and figuring out the right curriculum, I guess, for teaching models syntax in the most data efficient way, basically. And you're right that that's how humans also learn language. They don't start out by just like listening to audiobooks. They start with these very simple sentences, and then at the age of whatever 6, they start reading longer and longer sentences, more complex structures.
My last question on this work was a bit touching on the theme of representations that we've talked about a few times throughout the conversation. And your hypothesis for why depth facilitates this emergence of syntactic bias was basically that transformers generalize hierarchically on the basis of tree structured representations organized across layers. And so you did mention that you're starting to do work that is kind of digging deeper into all of this, but I'm sort of curious about how you develop a hypothesis that we have a representation that is organized in this particular way, and then how you think about developing an argument. We discussed earlier sort of how behavioral capacities might imply that a certain sort of representation has to exist. And so I guess I'm curious to understand a little bit deeper on your thinking about the formation and evaluation of this type of hypothesis.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we, in that discussion, we were inspired by work from Shikar Murthy, which so I think he would be the person to ask about this hypothesis and how he tested it. So basically, the hypothesis is that literally the tree is represented across the layers of the transformer. So certain, if this span is a constituent, you would see this little column across the transformer that represents that span. So you would need, if the depth of the tree is, let's say, 13, you might literally need 13 layers to represent that entire sentence in that way. And if you have less than 13 layers, you're going to have to start approximating it, and your behavior will be worse. So I think that's the hypothesis, that you build constituents, bigger and bigger constituents, as you go deeper in the network. And shallower networks have to find different ways of accomplishing the same thing that are less reliable, generalized less well.
That makes sense to me. I think this would be a good place to discuss some closing thoughts and maybe just for a couple of minutes, sort of, we touched on this at the introduction, but thematically, just about the intersection of linguistics and deep learning and sort of how you think about how people who are studying the different sorts of problems in both directions, what each of these fields can do for the other, how to sort of think about all of this. And there was maybe one kind of prediction that you made a while back that I wanted to ask you about, where you said, in the case of modeling language acquisition, the best predictors of psycholinguistic measurements might turn out to be hybrid neural networks that explicitly model the structure of the sentence. Is that something that you still think might be true? How do you think about that?
I think so still, yes. I think that we do need some stronger inductive biases than we have now to learn language from the amount of data that people learn from. So actually one of our other recent papers looked at the case of learning to form questions. And we looked at child-directed speech and all the questions that we have in the English part of the child-directed speech corpus, and trained a neural network to form a question from the declarative sentence that it is equivalent to. And the model was not able to learn to do that from the amount of evidence that existed in child-directed speech. So if you give it a lot more evidence, that it will eventually be able to do that. But it does seem that um, humans are more efficient in that way. Now that efficiency can come from a lot of sources. One of the sources could be architectural inductive biases, like having a tendency to construct trees for sentences and then perform all the tasks that you want to do with the sentence on that tree rather than on the sequence of words. That's one way that you can bias a model to learn more efficiently. I don't know if it's the only way. I think we're exploring different options there.
I think maybe a good sort of closing question here is one theme I really like that kind of goes throughout your work, and I think our discussion here is this question of, well, there's sort of a distinction to be made between developing models with the purpose of something like cognitive modeling and developing models with the purpose of performance on some specific task or set of tasks. And I think that this really brings some clarity, I suppose, to what feels like the often confused is deep learning, machine learning going in the correct direction, which is sort of a question I feel like you can't really ask or answer without having some notion of, well, what precisely are your goals in doing that? And so I feel like the way you sort of articulate yourself in all of this brings some much needed clarity there. And so I guess I'm curious, just from your perspective as, somebody who is now in this whole world of deep learning where people are having these often, they can be pretty vicious back and forths at times, just how you think about maybe ways to consider these sorts of questions maybe in a slightly more considered way, and thinking about those aims and understanding what are the different sort of paradigms, the different goals, maybe the different fields of study at play here.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to keep as just as you said, to keep in mind what you're trying to accomplish with a certain model. I mean, one example that's really at the top of my mind right now is logical reasoning. We have a project on logical reasoning, and there are many kind of famously humans are not very good at it. By logical reasoning, I mean things like some actors are bakers. Some bakers are chemists. Doesn't entail that some artists are chemists. That kind of thing. A kind of classic. It's called a syllogistic reasoning. It kind of goes back to Aristotle or something. And people are really bad at this. Maybe not at the specific example that I gave you, but there's some examples where almost everyone gives you the right answer, even kind of highly trained people. And so that really makes you wonder. I mean, would you ever want to have a language model that makes the same logical reasoning errors that humans make? Like, probably not. I mean, it's not so clear what the purpose of that would be, other than passing the Turing test, which is kind of a dumb goal. But if you really want to pass the Turing test, then you probably want to make the same errors that humans make. But for any practical applications, it's just not desirable, I think, for an AI system to have the same issues that humans have in reasoning. But if the goal is to understand how humans reason, and you want to use models for that, like maybe you would construct two different models that implement two different hypotheses about how humans reason, and one of them will make errors that are more similar to the human errors than the other one, then that simulation will provide some support, I guess, to the first theory about how humans reason. So that then mimicking human errors becomes a good thing. But it really depends, as you said, on your goals.
Sure. I think this is a really great place to end then. Well, Professor Linzen, your work is really, really fascinating. Again, I think you bring much needed clarity and an intersection of really important disciplines here. So I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and for speaking with me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. This was really fun.
And that is a wrap, my friends. As I mentioned at the start of the episode, you can subscribe to The Gradient on Substack to receive not just this podcast, but also our articles and newsletters directly to your email. You can also visit us at thegradient.pub, where you'll find all of that, as well as more information about the gradient and how you could even contribute if you're interested. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, we would really appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to leave a comment or review, we'd love to know how we can make this series more interesting and informative to you. And with all that, I'll leave you until the next episode.